Hi, I'm Kate. Welcome to my channel. How is everyone? I'm doing okay, but since the leaves have been falling, my allergies have been 2 or 3 times as bad. So my apologies if my voice is a little different. It's just allergies. But anyway, as you may have noticed from the title of this video already, today we're going to be talking about a pretty big case. I think this is the first time I'm covering a serial killer on the channel, and though I am going to try and not be too explicit in terms of specific violent acts, obviously this case is going to be covering some pretty horrible stuff, so just heads up about that. Today we are going to talk about Ricardo, better known as Richard Ramirez, aka the Valley Intruder, aka the Night Stalker. Ramirez was born in El Paso, Texas in 1960. He was the youngest of 5 siblings, and his childhood was not great, to say the least, and it is considered to be a major influence on his future crimes. His father had been a policeman in Mexico and then became a railway worker in the US, and he was an alcoholic, and he was known to have anger issues and was often physically abusive to his family, to the point that Ramirez would sometimes sleep in a cemetery nearby to escape, although another version of this story has his father actually tying Ramirez to a headstone in the cemetery overnight. When he was young, Ramirez had multiple head injuries, including most famously being knocked out by a swing when he was 5, after which he developed epilepsy. However, there's plenty of other things in his childhood that could have had just as big an effect on him, if not more. Probably the most famous examples of this was his relationship to his older cousin, Miguel, or Mike. And Mike was a Vietnam vet and had essentially become a serial killer himself over in Vietnam. He and Ramirez would smoke pot and drink beers together when Ramirez was as young as 10 years old. Also, in addition to teaching Ramirez some of the skills he'd picked up in the service, Mike also showed a 12-year-old Ramirez photos of really horrific scenes of violence towards Vietnamese women who were supposedly suspected of being loyal to the Viet Cong, but I mean, this was like war crime level stuff, and he was showing it to a very young boy. Not too long after this, during an argument, Mike actually shot and killed his wife in front of the then 13-year-old Ramirez. Later, Ramirez would say that he wasn't disturbed by seeing the photos or by witnessing the murder, but instead was excited and fascinated. After Mike was arrested for murdering his wife, Ramirez was then sent to live with his older sister, Ruth, and here Ramirez came into contact with another awful human being who likely played a part in shaping who Ramirez would end up being, his brother-in-law, Roberto. Roberto was a peeping Tom, although I feel like that's not really strong enough of a term for it. He would take the teenage Ramirez with him on these nighttime excursions. Once again, this is where Ramirez may have picked up some skills, like how to sneak around houses and spy on people and figure out who was vulnerable. Ramirez's cousin Mike was actually found not guilty of the murder of his wife by reason of insanity attributed to PTSD from his time in Vietnam. While it is entirely possible he did have PTSD, given what he did not only to his wife but to many women in Vietnam, he really should have spent more time in custody, if not the rest of his life, if for no other reason than he needed severe counseling and monitoring for his mental health. Instead, Mike spent only 4 years in a state mental hospital and was released in 1977, completely unchanged. Afterwards, he continued spending time with Ramirez and would even sometimes join Ramirez and Roberto to spy on women. By the time Ramirez was 14, he had not only experienced some heavy trauma, violence, and crime, he was using drugs pretty heavily, including LSD, and was also very interested in the occult and Satanism. While in high school, Ramirez worked at a Holiday Inn and used an employee pass key to go into guest rooms at night and rob them. And during the time that he worked there, he was also known to have assaulted a couple of children in an elevator, but it was never apparently reported to the authorities. He probably and may have done some other voyeuristic activities or even assaults during his time there. I wouldn't be surprised if that was part of the thrill of sneaking into guest rooms, but he was eventually caught attempting to assault a female guest. The woman's husband managed to stop it and beat Ramirez pretty badly. And Ramirez was fired, but the couple who lived in another state ultimately decided to not come back to testify against him, and any criminal charges were dropped. Ramirez dropped out of high school in the 9th grade and eventually moved to California by the age of 22. He was arrested for the first time in 1977 for possession, and again in 1981 and 1984 for auto theft. He seemed to really enjoy stealing cars, and I'm sure he did it a lot more than he was ever held accountable for. In 1984, he also committed his first known murder, and this is a murder that was not linked to him until much later, but he lured a 9-year-old girl into the basement of his apartment building under the guise of knowing where a lost dollar bill was. And once down there, he did some truly horrific things, which I'm not going to go into detail about here, but given the violence of this first known murder, it's possible it actually wasn't his first, as there's often escalation with these things, but given the exposure he had had in his youth to the photos his cousin showed him, it's also possible he was simply trying to emulate that. And Ramirez was only linked to this murder in 2009 after his DNA matched to samples taken from the scene. Another person's DNA was also found, suggesting Ramirez had a partner during this murder, but this person has not been publicly identified by the police, aside from the fact that they were supposedly a minor at the time and has since been convicted of other felonies. What was long believed to be his first murder actually happened only a couple months later, on June 28, 1984. Jenny Vinco, a 79-year-old woman, was found brutally stabbed to death in her apartment. Vinco had likely been murdered in her sleep after Ramirez entered her apartment through an open window, which showed the beginning of a pattern for him. In some ways, it may have actually at least began as a bit of a bonus for him to commit the murders in addition to the burglaries that he committed, because he clearly needed to do that in order to support his heavy drug use. For the most part, his victims seemed randomly picked based on when an opportunity presented itself, mostly through an opened or unlocked window or when people were getting in and out of their cars. One such assault happened next that we know of, on March 17th of 1985. This is when 22-year-old Maria Hernandez pulled into her garage, and Ramirez appeared and shot her after she got out of her car. Miraculously, Hernandez actually survived when she had raised her hand up, and he actually shot her keys that he was holding in her hand, and she played dead until Ramirez left. He went inside, and she got up and ran down an alley beside her home. Unfortunately, Ramirez then went into the house and shot Hernandez's roommate, 34-year-old Dale Yoshi Okazaki, as she tried to hide behind the kitchen counter, killing her instantly. Hearing the gunshot, Hernandez decided to try and go back to the house and check on her roommate, and actually came face to face with Ramirez at the front door. She basically was just asked him, "Are you going to shoot me again?" And instead of doing anything, he just walked away. That same day, within an hour of the other two shootings, Ramirez attacked 30-year-old Veronica Yu in her car and shot her twice, apparently for no reason, as he then immediately fled. It's possible that he had intended to steal her car, but got spooked or just changed his mind. These two murders and one attempted murder in one day got the media's attention, and thanks to Maria Hernandez, they had a physical description of him. His bad teeth in particular were noted, and the media quickly coined names for him, including the Valley Intruder. Only 10 days later, Ramirez decided to go back to a home he had actually burglarized a year before, and this home belonged to Vincent and Maxine Cesara. He shot and killed Vincent while he slept, and then beat Maxine, trying to get her to tell him where any money or valuables were. As he searched the room, Maxine apparently managed to grab a shotgun from under the bed, but it was unloaded. And Ramirez then shot and did some very disturbing things to her, which again I'm not going to go into detail on, but an autopsy determined that most of it was fortunately done after she had died. At the scene of this attack, Ramirez left behind footprints in the flower beds of the home, which the police were able to take casts of. It was ultimately determined that these shoe prints were from Avia sneakers, which were not a very common shoe. For some time, the basic description the police had gotten from survivors and the shoe print cast were all the evidence available, and the bullets used were all that connected the crime scenes at the time. Going on at around the same time, in February and March of 1985, a series of child abductions was happening. Young children were taken from their homes, things were done to them, and then they were eventually just left somewhere. The children were able to give enough of a description to police that at least one detective, a man named Gil Carrillo, suspected that the abductions might be connected to the previous attacks, which had resulted in a similar description from Maria Hernandez. But because it was so unusual for a criminal to target such a wide range of victims and to attack them in such varied ways, a lot of the other detectives didn't think Carrillo's hunch was likely. However, another child was eventually abducted and taken to a construction site, and because cement had recently been poured at the site, it was still wet enough that a shoe print was left behind by the assailant, and this shoe print matched the one that had been left behind at the Zazara house. Soon afterwards, Gil Carrillo partnered up with a more veteran detective, Frank Salerno, who was already well known for being involved in the Hillside Strangler case. On May 14th, Ramirez targeted the Monterey Park home of Bill and Lillian Doy, aged 66 and 56. The Doys were sleeping in separate bedrooms, so Ramirez entered Bill's room first and shot him as he was supposedly reaching for his own handgun. And then Ramirez went into the other bedroom and used thumb cuffs to bind Lillian while he searched the home for, again, whatever valuables he could steal. Both Lillian and Bill survived the initial attack, although Bill eventually died later in the hospital. About 2 weeks later, on May 29th, Ramirez took a car that he had stolen and drove to the house of two sisters who were in their 80s, Ma Bell and Florence Lang. He tied up and attacked both women with a hammer he found in the home. Before leaving, he used one of the women's lipstick to draw a pentagram, one on one of the sisters' legs and others on the walls of their bedrooms. As with the previous attack, both women initially survived, although they weren't found until 2 days later, but Bell eventually died in the hospital. The day after he'd attacked the sisters, Ramirez once again drove the stolen car to another home, that of Carol Kyle and her 11-year-old son. He forced Kyle to show him where any valuables were, while her son was handcuffed in a closet. He then repeatedly assaulted her before handcuffing to her son and leaving. Ramirez really began ramping things up after this. On July 2nd, again driving a stolen car, he chose the house of 75-year-old Mary Louise Cannon at random and killed her. 3 days later, he broke into another home and attempted to murder a 16-year-old girl. After hitting her with a tire iron, he tried and failed to find a knife, so he tried to use a telephone cord to strangle her. When he wasn't able to do so and the cord supposedly began sparking, he ran from the house and later said he believed Jesus had intervened in the attack to save her. She did survive the attack, but needed over 400 stitches to close the wounds caused by the tire iron. And at the crime scene was another matching shoe print. 2 days after that attack, on July 7th, Ramirez targeted 2 more homes. He first burglarized the house of 60-year-old Joyce Nelson and beat her to death. Then he broke into the home of 63-year-old Sophie Dickman, who, when swearing to God she wasn't hiding any valuable possessions from him, he famously said, quote, "Swear to Satan," end quote. On July 20th, Ramirez committed another double attack. First, he attacked and killed a Glendale couple, Layla and Max in Kneading, with a machete and a gun. He fenced the items he stole from their home before driving over to Sun Valley to the home of Chainarong and Samkid Kovanath. He shot Chainarong, tied up the couple's 8-year-old son, and then forced Samkid to show where any valuables were in the house. Once again, he made her swear to Satan that she wasn't hiding anything from him. On August 6th, Ramirez broke into the home of Chris and Virginia Peterson. He shot Virginia in the head and Chris in the neck, but miraculously didn't kill either of them. Chris even got up and went after Ramirez, who eventually managed to get away while Chris chased after him. 2 days later, he targeted the home of Sakina and Elias Abawath and their 3-year-old son. Here, he did the same routine as he had with previous homes, including once again making Sakina swear to Satan. Sakina and her son survived the attack, but her husband did not. Perhaps because of all the media coverage that had started overtaking Los Angeles over the past summer, Ramirez decided to take a break and headed to San Francisco. There, on August 18th, he attacked Peter and Barbara Pan in their home after entering through an unlocked window. Peter died in the attack, and Barbara was likely believed to have died as well by Ramirez, but ultimately survived. Before he left, Ramirez again used lipstick to draw a pentagram on a wall along with the words, quote, "Jack the knife," end quote. Also at this crime scene, Ramirez left behind another shoe print, which matched those left at scenes in Los Angeles and tied that crime together with the ones in Los Angeles despite the distance. Detectives managed to coordinate with the shoe's manufacturer and found that only 6 pairs of that kind of shoe in that size were distributed in the United States, and only 1 pair ended up in Los Angeles, the others ending up in Arizona. This meant not only that whatever crime scenes these shoe prints ended up at were likely connected, but that if they found those shoes, they found their killer. And unfortunately, after this information was shared with the San Francisco government to aid in any of their investigations, the then mayor of San Francisco, Dianne Feinstein, released that information, along with basically everything else that the police knew, in a televised press conference, which was incredibly stupid as it tipped Ramirez off and gave him the opportunity to get rid of the shoes, which he did, supposedly throwing them over the side of the Golden Gate Bridge that night. On August 24th, Ramirez once again headed outside of Los Angeles to target the Romero household in Mission Viejo. The Romero's 13-year-old son happened to be up late and heard Ramirez moving around outside. He hurried to wake up his parents, which made Ramirez flee, but not before the car he was driving and part of the plate was seen by James Romero, who relayed the information to the police. Still wanting to find someone to attack that night, Ramirez broke into the home of Bill Carnes and his fiancée Inez Erickson. He shot Carnes before turning on Erickson, whom he repeatedly attacked and again forced to swear on Satan that she had given him all money and valuables they had. Before he left, he told her to, quote, "tell them the night stalker was here," end quote. Carnes was taken to the hospital and had to have surgery to remove 2 of the 3 bullets he'd been shot with, and both he and Erickson survived. Erickson was able to give a description to the police, which again closely matched what the other survivors had said. The stolen car, which was identified based on the information given by James Romero, was found abandoned a few days later, and police recovered a fingerprint from the rearview mirror, despite the rest of the car being wiped clean. Unfortunately, they didn't have anything to match it against, as this was before there were computer databases, which could automatically match fingerprints. As Ramirez had been arrested before, his prints had been taken, but there was no way they could go through and manually compare every print on file. They would need a suspect before they could compare the recovered print. They were so close, but this wasn't actually the first time they had been so close. In an earlier attack, which had not initially been connected to the same perpetrator, a man had attempted to abduct a young woman who had managed to fight him off. The man then drove off in a Toyota. Shortly afterwards, a police officer managed to pull the same Toyota over for a traffic violation, but the driver ran off before he could be caught, but not before drawing a pentagram in dirt on the windshield. Detectives Carrillo and Salerno made the connection between this car and their unknown suspect and tracked the car to an impound lot. They requested to have the car tested for prints, but because they were technically in a different jurisdiction, they weren't able to get access to the car for weeks. When they were finally able to get through all the red tape, they discovered that the car had actually been stored outside the entire time, and any evidence that might have been on the car was destroyed. Inside the car, however, they found a business card from a dentist, and this dentist confirmed that the suspect was a patient going by the name Richard Mena, and that he had just been in the office 5 days before the police had come in. And if they'd been able to find that card earlier and intercept Ramirez at that point, he could have been stopped there. The other information that this Richard had given to the dentist was fake, but his x-rays showed that he had an impacted tooth, which would require another visit soon. Police decided to have someone sort of camped out daily in the dentist office until Richard came back in, but after a while this was deemed too expensive, and instead a button was installed that the dentist could press to alert the police if Richard came back in. Supposedly the very first day that this button was used and a member of law enforcement was not in the office, Richard came in. The button, however, was apparently not hooked up properly, and the police weren't alerted until after he had left, which was obviously devastating. But anyway, now they had a print. But again, they needed something to compare it to. And the police were getting a huge amount of tips coming in. Most of them were probably completely unrelated, but they still did get a tip from a woman who said her father, who was possibly living on the streets. It's not super clear. He was described as a street person, but this man apparently spent a lot of time at a bus depot where he became acquainted with a man from El Paso who he called Rick, and who he thought could be the Night Stalker. Rick had supposedly told the man about one of the murders in Monterey Park, and that he had used a .22 pistol to shoot the victims, which was not publicly known information. The man had also said that Rick had actually given the gun to him, and that he had subsequently given it to someone else in Tijuana. Detectives took the man down to Tijuana to track down the gun, which they were able to recover, along with a boombox, which they determined, based on matching serial numbers, had been stolen from the Bell and Lang home. So now they had two information sources that tied someone named Richard or Rick pretty conclusively to the crimes: the dentist office and the gun and boombox. And a police informant in San Francisco named Earl Gregg turned in a bracelet which he said might be tied to the Night Stalker. He had gotten the bracelet from his mother-in-law, who lived in San Pablo, California. She then told police that she had gotten the bracelet from her boyfriend, a man named Armando Rodriguez, who had supposedly gotten it from his friend from El Paso, a man named Rick, who fit the description given by surviving witnesses exactly. When police went to talk to Armando Rodriguez, he initially violently refused to cooperate, and when police threatened him, I'm not saying I condone that, he did eventually give up Ramirez's last name. So now they had a full name, assuming that it was, in fact, a real name. So back in Los Angeles, they came up with 8 potential Richard Ramirez's and checked their fingerprints against the print recovered from the rearview mirror. One, of course, matched. And they had a booking photo of him from one of his arrests about 8 months prior, which the police informant confirmed was the Rick that they knew. After some debate as to whether it was a good idea to reveal Ramirez's identity to the public or to withhold the information that they had identified him so as not to alert him, both Los Angeles and San Francisco police released the information in what was described as a media blitz on August 30th. The photo of Ramirez and all the information that they had about him was everywhere by the next day. Knowing that once Ramirez realized he had been identified, he would run, police staked out the bus depot that he'd been seen hanging out at before, and apparently he traveled on buses through there and even had a locker there. And when the information came out about Ramirez's identity, he had actually been in Arizona visiting his brother. So he did not see this huge media blitz in Los Angeles. So when he did come back in through the bus depot, he was coming back to Los Angeles and entered the depot through a different door than the one that police were expecting. And he spotted the undercover cops, and not necessarily knowing that it was for him, he was still spooked by the cops and took off. He went down the street and ducked into a liquor store where he saw his face on the cover of every newspaper. Now, full on panicking, he left the store and got onto the first city bus that he saw. Someone on the bus had a paper and recognized Ramirez, and the passenger pulled the stop cord on the bus, got off, and went over to a phone booth to call the police. Other people started recognizing Ramirez as well, and he got off the bus, and as Ramirez ran, more people saw him and called police. Ramirez tried to carjack a man, but the man fought back, and Ramirez took off on foot again. Eventually, he ended up in a residential neighborhood where he tried to carjack another person, a woman, and neighbors and the woman's husband quickly came to help and began chasing and beating Ramirez, who they quickly recognized. The woman's husband hit him over the head with a metal pipe, it was described as. So he was hurt kind of badly, and at this point he was also exhausted from running and just kind of gave up. A squad car responded to the scene and arrested Ramirez, who supposedly stated he was lucky the police had shown up because the people in the neighborhood might have killed him, and they may very well have. Apparently they were still kind of acting like they wanted to even after the police car arrived and took him into custody. And he just kind of told the officer, yeah, you got me. I'm the guy that everyone's looking for.
Yeah, we will. What have you been arrested for? You ever been arrested before?
Danny, where's your car?
Never been arrested before in L.A.?
Fourth one down.
When? How long ago? Sit up. How long ago?
Let's get all these.
What's your name?
Huh?
What's your name?
11.
While he did seem annoyed that he had been caught, in the film clips of him being taken into custody, he ducks his head a lot. It seems like he eventually decided to enjoy the attention. For example, he was excited to be put in the same jail cell as one of the Hillside Stranglers, Kenneth Bianchi, who he apparently looked up to. And by the time his trial started in 1988, it seems like he was just trying to freak people out as much as he could, drawing the pentagram on his palm, saying, "Hail Satan." He got crime scene photos of his victims from his lawyers and hung them up on the walls of his cell to scare other prisoners, and drew pentagrams onto his prison uniform as well. He supposedly threatened to kill the prosecutor with a smuggled gun, so they installed metal detectors and searched people entering the courtroom.
After years of delay, the man who held Los Angeles in terror for months finally faces a jury.
In the course of his 1989 trial for multiple murder, the haughty looks and bad attitude of serial killer Richard Ramirez inspired a startling new brand of cult appeal among many of the nation's disaffected youth. Playing his perverse role of a rock star-styled rebel to the hilt, Ramirez even cultivated a devoted female fan following. In jail, he told a fellow inmate, "I've killed 20 people, man. I love all that blood."
And he would sit there, just staring everybody down, and you couldn't help but feel uneasy.
One of the jurors, a woman named Phyllis Singletary, was actually found shot to death in her apartment after not showing up to court one day. And this obviously made people wonder if Ramirez had somehow arranged it, but it was ultimately determined that she had been shot by her boyfriend. Ramirez was eventually convicted of all charges brought against him, including 13 counts of murder, and was sentenced to death. After the sentencing, he told reporters, quote, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland," end quote. Despite this, he did try to appeal multiple times, all of which were denied. While in prison, he somehow had a lot of female fans, which is creepily common for serial killers who wrote letters and even visited him. One woman, Doreen Loy, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, wrote to him dozens of times, and on her third visit to see him in 1988, he proposed to her, saying, quote, "It's my wish to marry you," end quote. Doreen claimed to think he was innocent of all the crimes he was accused of, despite all of the evidence and him admitting to it. But they ended up getting married in 1996, but split in 2009 when DNA connected Ramirez to the death of the little girl that I talked about earlier. And this is apparently where she drew the line. Ramirez was also potentially in a relationship with at least one other woman named Christine Lee, to whom he was possibly engaged to when he died in 2013 of complications caused by cancer. Information on this relationship is a bit sketchy at best, and Ramirez was never officially divorced from his previous marriage. At the end of the day, Richard Ramirez definitely creeps me out. He's part of the reason I'm so paranoid about making sure my windows and doors are locked, but I also think he was just a coward. He liked manipulating and scaring people. It probably made him feel powerful, like he was in control, but looking at his actions, you can see he was not the inhuman terror that he liked to project. The way he carried out his crimes at night when people were asleep, usually entering a home through an unlocked door or window and immediately targeting any adult men to take them out of the equation, he didn't want any chance at confrontation or struggle. Most of the people he attacked, though I believe were mostly random, happened to be mostly elderly people or families with young children who would probably be easier to threaten. If confronted by someone who could actually fight back, or if he tried to attack someone and it didn't work, he ran. He liked to control people with fear, even when he was on trial, flashing pentagrams around and talking about Satan, because he knew that that would freak people out. He went through a lot of trauma, both physically and mentally when he was young, and that wasn't his fault. But he made a lot of choices later that were his fault to make other people into victims. Okay, that's it. This should be a bit of a longer video, I think. And my voice is starting to give out a little bit, so I'm gonna go ahead and just wrap this up and say thank you for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.